I have mixed feelings on it. So I'll be honest, like kind of a weird old school opinion I have. I like blue books. I think there is a world where that type of assessment can coexist with all the other types of assessment that exist.
We can still use existing assignments, activities, assessments, but the purpose of those assignments has now changed. And how do we make that the lesson rather than the completion of an artifact for a grade?
Welcome, everybody. We have a special edition of AI in Education. And our guest today is Chris Ostro. Chris Ostro is an assistant teaching professor at University of Colorado Boulder. We'll have him introduce himself also, so you can hear a lot more than that. So I'm now going to turn it over to our special guest.
Hey there, everyone. My name is Christopher Ostro, and I'm an assistant teaching professor at the University of Colorado Boulder over in continuing education, where I teach classes for the program of writing and rhetoric, as well as 50% of my contract is doing course design, trainings, things like that for faculty. So I like to think of myself as a teaching course designer. I'm still in the classroom. I'm seeing the sort of things as they're breaking and the crises as they arise, but also I'm on the back end trying to provide solutions and build scaffolding and trainings for faculty going through the same stuff.
And I'm Matt Stilwell. I am instructional coach at our Larimer campus of Front Range Community College and also English faculty at the Larimer campus. And I find it, I don't know, I find it interesting that there's so many writing and rhetoric folks who are also engaged in the AI conversation. And I know among my colleagues, there might be as many who are really worried about the impacts that AI are going to have on reading and writing. But I'm interested to hear what Christopher has to say about assessment. And I've seen him speak a couple of times. And so I'm looking forward to our conversation.
My name is Jenn Sheaman. I'm the Director of Assessment and Accreditation at Front Range. And as Kay said, we've had some conversations back and forth. I'm a complete novice at AI, but I know enough to know that AI will dramatically impact how we conduct learning outcomes assessment from here on out. So I'm excited to hear what we all have to say. I have not had a chance to see Christopher speak, so I'm happy to be part of the conversation.
So much buildup. Oh man. Going to Matt's question, by the way, I think a big part of the reason that like writing and rhetoric folks were on the forefront is because we were also some of the first people to notice things breaking, right? Like things in my class broke because I've also taught Latin. I've taught test prep. I used to teach ACT and SAT back when I taught high school. I also taught English and history, right? So like I've kind of meandered around a few different, and like the way things broke, the way that AI and LLMs kind of hit the beachhead of writing classes was sort of historically unique, right? Suddenly, all of my students were turning in work that's lazy in a way that had never been like that before. And that's interesting. And I actually think that now, 2 years later, 2.5 years later, my students' AI use has changed pretty dramatically. And I think that's interesting too.
Hi, everybody. I'm Donna Hall. I'm a senior instructional designer at University of Colorado Boulder. Been working with a lot of instructors that are pretty worried about, the use of AI, trying to help them think about it. Not that it's this big bad monster, but it's a way to help them have more time and get past when they get stuck, to give them an idea to get them unstuck and to help students learn how to use AI ethically. So that's mainly what I've been working on with them.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Okay, we're gonna get started with Chris because we don't get all day with him. We only get maybe about an hour at the most. Okay, so let's start by asking him, what do you think the current state of AI and assessment is? You said that, it's different now than 2 years ago. What would you say the state of the union for AI and assessment is right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big changes that we now definitely live in a non-securable era for assessment, right? Like there is no type of assessment that we could ever feel is 100% secure anymore. And that is a big change. That is not how it was a few years back, especially as things like new smart glasses, the Meta Ray-Bans, for example, come out and are increasingly cheaper. Any any attempt we have at telling ourselves like I've created a magic bullet, everyone who does this assessment, I have a real clear idea of what they know, we are lying to ourselves. And but I also want to point out that I think to some degree that's always been a bit of the case. Like people could always have cheated. It's just that now it's a lot easier, B, a lot cheaper, and C, we can't even really rely on, backbone sort of blue booky sort of assessments. Like truly the way we assess all of this content, that discussion just needs to change from the ground up. I also think a lot of this ties in with the lack of value arguments we've been making about our content, right? I grew up in an era where the college degree as its own thing was viewed as valuable, right? And I remember going to college, I was told just to major in anything and it'll work out. That is literally what I was told when I was applying for student loans. And, I don't think that same advice would probably be great advice for students now. But also, I grew up in an era where I understood the value of a lot of these topics because I don't know, that was really part of the milieu of education. A lot of my students are coming into higher ed now not understanding why am I taking this science class? I'm going into whatever. Or why am I taking this writing class? I'm going into math. And I feel like we have kind of gotten a little lazy. Not when I say we, I mean all of higher ed has gotten a little lazy at sort of making the value arguments for why our content matters. And AI kind of hit at the worst time for that, right? There was just a whole pandemic. People were already starting to look at college degrees increasingly as just an investment rather than as having value kind of intellectually. And then a tool came out that allowed them to really shortcut assignments if they don't see the value. And so it's just sort of a worst of all time sort of situation. I earnestly think that if these tools had come out 5 years earlier or 10 years later, things would have been much more positive.
And speaking of which, you introduced yourself as teaching Latin. I know on our learning design team, we often have a debate about the usefulness of Latin.
Sure. I think it's pretty useful, my 2 cents, but it's also useful as a puzzle, right? Like I was originally an engineering student. I took Latin because it's just math with words. Right. And like that's what got me into linguistics generally was this realization that it's just math, but instead of random numbers and variables, it's words. But also, I think my Latin is a big part of the reason that I keep scoring super high on any quant test that I take. Right. Like it is learning Latin forces you to understand and like break something apart and reassemble it in a different fashion. Latin is a language that doesn't have word order. Right. Every sentence forces you to really kind of I'm trying not to go too hard here for the listeners. I don't know how many hardcore Latin files we have, but like it forces you to actually think about things from this new direction that I think is analytically deeply impactful on me.
Okay, so here's our next question for you. Agentic AI taking quizzes, taking tests. I mean, that really hit around mid-September. And now we're getting towards the end of November. What impact do you think that made?
Well, I think the impact so far has been relatively small, but growing. But I also think it's more about it being a harbinger, right? Like right now, Google has already said that one of their next Chrome updates is going to have agentic powers built in. It currently doesn't. There are currently features you can like play with in some of the closed betas, but they have not rolled that out yet. But when the most used browser in the world has these capabilities built in, I think that's going to be where we see a lot more of an impact. Because right now, as it is, people have to go download some weird browsers like Comet, which I'm going to throw out there. Comet has went out of its way to make it, I would argue, a little gray area, right? I don't know if people know this, but you can't even blacklist it on the access logs, right? If someone is using Comet on Canvas, if you look at the access log, it shows up as just Chromium browser. So they've also kind of went out of their way to make it hard to deal with, which is part of my frustration in the first place. I understand these tools are going to exist, but I wish that vendors and companies making them would actually maybe try to at least have an eye towards higher ed and its needs. Because if this browser came out, but also I could go on Canvas and just blacklist, okay, no one can take quizzes using this browser. What a better life. But it kind of feels like there are certain incentives in place where companies didn't want to do that. So I think that up until now, it has been kind of a muted impact. I mean, for what it's worth, we've already had concerns. I've already talked with faculty. I've talked to people in the honor code office about instances where they're fairly certain this has happened. But, they're still relatively isolated. But I think that's going to change once this is, added to the most used browser in the world.
So what are your thoughts about how do we view assessments moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, so this goes back to that sort of mosaic approach talk that I gave for elk back in the day, but I kind of think it's that, but just leveled up. I think a big part of this is I firmly am trying to just open up my classes with these conversations with my students. I have found that if I just tell my students my anxieties about AI, they have way more anxieties than I do. Spoilers, I already have a job. I already have a career, even as fledgling as it might be, and as tumultuous as higher ed might be. I have a thing. Most of my students right now do not have the assumption they will have a job, right? When I talk with them about their future careers, they're panicking, right? That they are terrified. And when I bring up AI to them, they have more negative things to say in some ways than I do. So I've been trying to just normalize and center those conversations. And then beyond that, I've been trying to make the value argument claims, like I said, about my own content. Why are you taking this writing class? Let me tell you what I think this will help you with in your life. Right. And hey, I don't think that's going to win over everyone, but it wins over a lot of students. And then finally, I try to meet the really cynical students where they are. You're just in this class because you want to get a job. That's great. No one's going to give you a six-figure salary just passing on AI output uncritically, right? So for you, let's maybe figure out how you can get better at using these tools. Because I don't know, I found that like I would love a world where none of these things existed. I would love a world if I could push a button and just unmake all the progress we've made on LLMs in the last 5 years. I totally would, but I can't. Like that's just not a power I have. But the power I do have is meeting my students where they are. And so I've been trying to kind of make the value arguments for my class, meet my students where they are with their motivations. And then ultimately, I've just embraced AI literacy in the classroom, right? In my first year writing class, I hollowed out a huge portion of the class. There are now 6 or 7. I'm in the middle of massaging it out still. AI literacy lectures throughout the semester where we are doing stuff in the class with it. I've demystified something. My students aren't trying to hide their AI use. We're having conversations about it. I'm drawing pretty clear ethical lines because we're having these conversations with them. And so for me, that's been a lot of how I'm approaching it. And then ultimately, my assessments themselves have changed too, right? They're a lot more multi-layered. There's a lot more fewer big assessments, but those big assessments have way more scaffolding, right? I want to see how my students got there, not just what the there is. We live in a world now where you can generate 10 really polished, stupid essays in like a minute. I don't need that, right? I would much rather one very polished, stupid essay that I saw them spend weeks working on that I could actually intervene on the process and give them feedback and give them all that stuff. So that's been my approach.
Any questions for Christopher from anybody else?
I have many.
Okay, go for
and
it.
like you said, since we've only got Christopher for an hour,
go
like
for it.
we got to make hay while the sun shines. No, but I'm going to start simply. So, Christopher, how do you feel about, based on what you've just said, how do you feel about the return to blue books in some courses as a reaction to AI abuse? I mean, is there a certain irony in returning to those kinds of assessments in a digital age?
I have mixed feelings on it. So I'll be honest, like kind of a weird old school opinion I have. I like blue books. I think there is a world where that type of assessment can coexist with all the other types of assessment that exist. I do not think it is bad pedagogy to occasionally have your students have to show off their knowledge in a high stress moment, because I think that exists in the real world. It exists in various jobs, and there's a world where that can be valuable. I just don't think it's a great solution to this crisis. Because, like I said, tools are coming out that are fixing, or quote unquote, fixing this right now. Right. I mean, if anyone here is familiar with Cluely, I would highly encourage you to take a look if you're not. Right. Cluely is literally an app where the slogan is cheat on everything. And literally their ad is someone using the app with smart glasses to fake their way through a first date. If you can do that, how is that? First of all, we can also just set aside the horrifying implications of that, right? But also, like, if they can do that, 100% students could do that on a blue book exam. And those, I don't know if people here have actually looked at, these $200 Meta Ray Bans, they're $220 or something now. That's a price point many students can afford. And those glasses, I mean, they are essentially silent because they use the same technology as earbuds. Right. So unless I'm like creeping in real close and getting right next to that student's head, I'm not going to be able to hear it. Right. And I'm still at a place where I can identify those glasses. But first of all, that won't always be the case. Right. A year from now, there'll be a dozen or 24 different sets of glasses. But the other thing is, even if I identify that like little young Matt is wearing AI glasses, I can't do anything. Right. It's an accessibility law. I can't be like, take off your glasses and take that exam. That's crazy. Right. I could maybe tell that student they can't take the exam and I could force them to take it in the testing center, but that's about all I can do. So I just don't view the return of blue books it is ironic for sure, Matt. I just don't view it as a solution to the AI crisis. I view it as just kicking the can down the road, but it's stepping out of traffic in one lane to step in front of it in another.
I think it's interesting, they said go back to blue books, but how many instructors are verifying that the people that are filling out the blue books are the people they're supposed to be and not someone that the student has paid to take the exam for them?
Yeah, at the very least, that at least, like one of the things Trisha Bertram Gallant talks about in her book, The Opposite of Cheating, is how one of the things AI has done is it's just lowered the opportunity of cost for cheating, right? Like back in the day, like let's say we went back up to even just 2015. What an idyllic. None of us knew how much simpler of a time that was. But, in 2015, there was a website called Unemployed PhDs. You could go and you could hire someone. You could literally post your papers like a bounty, and people would like auction. Yeah, and they would literally do it. You could literally hire them to do a fake dissertation for you, which is crazy. Like they would coach you on the defense of a thing you didn't write. I don't even know how that would work. But cheating has always existed, but think about how much dedication that takes. And also how, if you were doing that in 2015, you had to admit to yourself, I know I'm cheating. Like I know I am ethically breaking a line. And actually, one of the things that Trisha Bertram Gallant talks about in her book is that itself, that internal line matters a lot to a lot of students. If young Matt can look at himself in the mirror and say, I cheated, that actually costs people a lot. It changes the way they view themselves in a real way. And AI, and especially agentic AI, as it's increasingly common, is basically allowing people to cut these corners without ever really doing that self-reflection. And I think that's where part of the problem is. I don't think all students cheat. That has been far from my experience. I just think this has made it. I think some students will cheat no matter what you do. Some students would never cheat. And then there's a lot of students who could be talked into it based on how easy it is. And it's just literally never been easier.
Well, that's why we lock our cars at night, right? It's not to prevent actual theft. It's to prevent the generally well-meaning individual who just happens to walk by and pull on our door handle.
Yeah. Well, and it's also like during the pandemic, I got really into lock picking because I don't know, you wouldn't believe this, but a high energy person who really, really needs a hobby that forces him to slow down. And lock picking is a good example. But also one of the I also am a biker. I bike everywhere. One of the things I learned very quickly is that we've never invented an unpickable lock. It's just we've made locks that are very time consuming to pick. But ultimately, if I get one of those disc locks that's cheap and I throw it on my bike, all I'm really doing is putting something on that takes about 10 minutes to pick. And I'm basically saying, does someone have 10 minutes of risk to take here? And is my bike shitty enough? Spoilers, it is. That they're not going to spend 15 minutes trying to steal it. They won't. That I'm good. Right. But if I have a really nice bike, that 15 minutes is probably actually not as helpful. So the different security things we put on, it really matters on the incentives.
Yeah, that's awesome. I apologize, Kay. I appear to maybe have taken over the question asking, but I have one more, and then I can be quiet. Again, I already mentioned I've seen you speak before, Christopher, so I feel like I have
Thank you.
An idea of.
Also, I saw you speak there as well, for its worth, and yeah, you had a. Anyway, it was a great.
I appreciate
conference.
it. Yeah. So on the plus side, to what extent is AI now accelerating the adoption of assessment and curricular forms that we've been debating for like the last 25 years? So like ungrading, or you've already alluded to the fact that, and I've heard you yourself say, like we can still use existing assignments, activities, assessments, but the purpose of those assignments has now changed. And how do we make that the lesson rather than the completion of an artifact for a grade?
Yeah, I mean, I think that these tools have basically liquefied everything, and everything is up for grabs in a real way when it comes to assessment, right? I totally agree. I think things like authentic assessment are definitely having a moment in the sun right now because it's become very clear that you can line up authentic assessment principles with things that, scaffolding and whatever, things that make AI, I guess, more resilient assignments. I hesitate to even use that word because I don't think they're AI proof. I just think it would be so much more work to cheat with these assignments using AI rather than like doing them with your teacher. But, these things, like a lot of these debates have largely gotten more traction because of that. But I also think part of it is like, I don't know if people here have looked at Casorla's inverted blooms taxonomy, but I think that's something that's fascinating to me too, that like the way that AI works and the way that it's impacting learners has actually changed the order of what learning looks like for some people, right? And actually, back in the day, one of the most trivial things, just memorizing and being able to regurgitate facts. When I was learning Latin, having to, OSTMUSTISNT, like just memorizing that chart and then being able to show that I'd memorized it, that was that lowest level. That's actually now one of the hardest things for students, right? And this has just changed what learning looks like in a real way. And of course, the implications of that on assessment are profound. And I go back and forth, right? Because I think some places are being a little too radically aggressive on it. Like I've seen so many professors who were like, I just ungraded my whole thing. And it's like, that's great. Did other teachers in your department do the same? Because if not, I have no idea how you have standardized this across your department. But also, on the other hand, I think we should have been asking these questions for a much longer time, right? Like we really should have been asking, are our assessments actually assessing something of value? Because I say this as someone who, again, was a private tutor for hire for years, right? For so long, it was very clear to me that the SAT or ACT or any number of standardized tests weren't just necessarily measuring someone's knowledge. They're measuring the amount of resources and time someone could throw at this. And I don't know if that was ever the intention of that test. And I kind of feel like that same thing is now happening just in all assessment. We're realizing what we were assessing is maybe not what we thought.
No, I'm just going to throw this because you said the inverted blooms. And since I teach design, I disagree with the inverted blooms.
Sure.
For me, creation is still, creation is still the highest level, but what I expect students to create should also be at a higher level since they can use AI tools. Have you been talking to people about that, about how the rubrics or the evaluations or the standards or the outcomes might change because AI tools now are being used?
Oh, yeah. Sorry. When I brought up inverted blooms, I
Mhm.
wasn't necessarily trying to be like, everyone, this is a thing that is definitely real.
It's okay.
As much as just saying that, like, truly this much is up for grabs now, right? Like this much is now, Bloom's, how old is Bloom's taxonomy, right? Like a few
50s.
Yeah, right. Like
Mhm.
75 years in the sun as like a thing that, multiple generations of educators have come and gone, really thinking of blooms as a
Mhm.
backbone of our understanding of pedagogy. And AI has melted stuff to the point that even that is being debated right now. That's all I'm pointing to more than anything.
Mhm.
I generally would agree with you that actually, in terms of cognitive processes, keeping creation at the top probably is more accurate. I'm just saying that like this is all up for grabs. But yeah, I generally think I think more than anything in this moment, when I'm having these conversations with the faculty,
Mhm.
one of the things I think is fascinating is we really, 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 really need to actually go through the brass tacks discussion of each of these steps right now.
Mhm.
Because it's so easy for people to just keep doing stuff traditionally the way they have. Maybe they tweak one or two things and think that's enough. And it's like, no, 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 no. Actually, what is your goal here? Right? Let's actually go through step by step what you are actually building towards here. And I think in some ways it's annoying because a lot of people aren't paid enough to do that, I would argue. But also, this is a moment to actually radically improve our classes and potentially make these assessments more valuable too. And so again, this is one of the things I feel like AI in many ways, I don't know, I'm a huge sci-fi nerd, right? I'm a huge Star
Mhm.
Trek guy. And in many ways, I feel like if these tools had come out in a Star Trek universe, they would be greeted largely just as miracles because the impacts on accessibility, the impacts on uh, um, the ability to just do live translation, like all of the, there's so many things about this that are obviously positives, but
Mhm.
the structures in our society that are being impacted by it are all so threadbare and underfunded that it's hitting in kind of a terrible way, right? If people didn't get their health insurance and their entire livelihood from a job that is now being made insecure by these tools,
Mhm.
I think people would be less threatened, right? I think, and same thing with teaching, right? If our faculty, I work with so many people who are basically being asked to just redesign their classes for free and they have no idea if these redesigns will even hold. That's a hard pitch, right? But we are at a place where a lot of that redesign has to happen. And so I think that's one of the things I just find fascinating about this moment more than anything.
I have a question about since you're talking about it, like resistance to AI. How have you seen how have you seen faculty and instructors deal with resistance to using AI from their students?
So I'll be honest, in my classrooms, I have yet to encounter a student who
Mm.
resists that. Like I have just never had that. I have heard of that happening, but generally speaking, I mean, if it depends on what kind of instructor you are, I guess. If you're running
Mhm.
a class that has like huge AI literacy components and you are someone who I would say I work with a lot of faculty who aren't what I would call early adopters, but are people who are cynical realists, right? My
Okay.
students are using this, so I'm pulling it into the class in a certain few ways, and we're going to have some discussions on this and use this as a way to teach some AI literacy and skepticism. In those cases, I've heard of a few people who've had students who opt out, but even then, they just, if they're opting out, like, great, here's a traditional alternative, I guess, right? I'm all for that. If students have their own ethical lines, I understand that, but I also think it's important to be mindful of where we put those lines to a degree too. I'm all for my students having those ethical lines, but it's also important for them to learn some of these basic things. I don't want those ethics get in the way of them actually learning like certain types of skepticism around these tools, right? And so yeah, I would encourage faculty to have some additional assignments they could give as an alternative substitute, but also be willing to have conversations with those students and ask why, right? Because I don't know, I find that oftentimes when my students are anytime I've had a conversation with a student who has a principled stand about AI, it's often coming from this place of immense anxiety. And I want to be able to talk through that thing because I also feel that same anxiety. But to me, the answer to that anxiety is understanding this stuff more so that we can more properly, like, kind of deal with it in the ways we should and then quarantine it in the ways we shouldn't. And I feel like oftentimes if someone's response is just like, I hate this, so I'm not going to use it at all, they've actually just not challenged it in the slightest. It's actually just going to continue doing its thing.
So I'm going to pause. Other questions for Chris?
I have another question for you, Chris. So thank you for kind of going through your process and talking about the things that you would ask. And I very much appreciate you saying, let's address that AI is being used. Let me help guide you with that. And then let's also pair with that the value argument about context. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are. So let me back up a little bit. That seems to be very much on the classroom level, which is exactly where we need to start. As part of my responsibilities are helping folks through assessment of our institutional learning outcomes. So what our process looks like right now, and we're changing for a few different reasons, but I would love to hear your thought on this. We're collecting student work, which we call artifacts, that is evaluated by a rubric that the state created. And these folks that are doing the evaluation along with this rubric are not necessarily subject matter experts. And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or guidance on how we apply some of these principles outside of just the cosmos of the classroom and then take it to a broader scale of learning assessment at the institution.
So have you considered having AI do all the grading? No, I'm just kidding. I'm sorry.
You saw me unmute so fast. I was like, okay, we're gonna need you for longer than an hour.
I just wanted to make people laugh. I'm sorry. I still got that class count energy. But yeah, I mean, look, as you go up the hierarchy, it gets obviously more complicated, right? I've run into this in my own, right? Like I have a system in my classroom, right? That whole Mosaic approach where I'm layering different things that I think works really well in my classroom, but would be a nightmare in a bigger classroom, right? If I had 100 students, I don't know how I would do that, right? If in my in-person versus my online, those are radically different approaches. So on the one hand, I kind of think you're in an unenviable situation in terms of like as you scale up the number of types of classrooms that are under your purview, that gets harder and more complex. On a very real way, part of my solution there would be trying to find if you could even have different types of policies and standards and procedures for different types of classrooms. By the way, one of the other things that doesn't get talked about enough, but I just want to throw out there is a huge difference between teaching a prereq, like first year class, versus a class of specialists and majors, right? If you're teaching intro to writing and all those students don't want to be there versus you're teaching like Shakespeare for your juniors, those students self-selected to be there and have a certain amount of interest that changes the way they'll approach the material. And I think that's a whole separate variable that does not get discussed enough. But anyway, but yeah, I mean, so my advice on the system level approach would be like looking for where you can actually, what are different types of classes and different scripters where you can start making different types of policies. I really think that the university level, we're probably going to see like buckets of policies form. Like at CU, I can already start to kind of see this, right? Like different types of lab classes are starting to really amalgamate certain types of policies and procedures together, right? Certain types of writing classes versus coding, right? Those two classes have totally different issues that these tools have presented. to their integrity and to assessment and to just teaching generally. And so my hunch is that would be part of the approach. But can you tell me a little bit more about your process? So you were talking about, the students create artifacts, then it's graded by non-subject matter experts. Tell me a little bit more about that, because maybe if I knew some more detail, I could give
For
some more
sure.
feedback.
I'll start by saying that we need to separate out assessment from grading. So the assignment is still graded by the teacher. What happens is then we do a call for a particular institutional learning outcome. So Matt just put in the chat regarding critical thinking. Critical thinking is one of our institutional learning outcomes. We do a call for student work and assignments that would be able to be evaluated with this rubric for critical thinking. And so then those student artifacts are turned in to us. We have a group of people who opt in to do the assessment of this. So it's less about grading whether the content was correct, but rather did the student communicate their process, or did the student hit these different skill components?
Okay, yeah. So knowing that, sorry to interrupt.
Okay.
So knowing that, I mean, a few things I would immediately, do you have an agreed upon AI policy there with students? Is there, at that level, is there a consistency of AI policy?
There is not. And I'll also point out something that we keep saying that I've heard today, I hear in other spaces where we're talking about AI along with cheating. So we say, well, students have always been able to cheat. And I think that we have to be a little bit careful to not conflate those two things. So I just wanted to say that for the good of the order.
Of course.
But no, there's a state board policy that's been created. It has not been brought out to the schools. We have not talked about how we would implement that or contextualize it for Front Range. So they're working on an AI policy, but I'm guessing it will be vague enough for schools to be able to adopt it in the way they want to.
Yeah, so I love your note, by the way, about not conflating all AI use with cheating. 100%. There's tons of ethical, great above board uses. I think one of the problems is like, A, there are also lots of students using it unethically. B, it's also very hard to discern ethical versus unethical use. And C, on top of that, I don't know if I said numbers or letters, so I was going to say C. C, on top of that, right? Like there are lots of students who are, I keep hearing from my students this rhetoric of almost being trapped in their AI use, right? Multiple students of mine have openly expressed to me feeling reliant on these tools and that they can't not be. And I think that's one of the things I find really worrying. But yeah, so there's tons of things to say positively about AI use too, but I also think it's really important that we set up guardrails, because I don't know about y'all, but like I was not at my most self-controlled and mindful when I was 19. Right, like college age students, it's kind of not the era you think of as people with like great self-care habits, we'll say. And I think that AI just ties into that. I'd said earlier in this talk that one of the things I find fascinating is how much my students' AI use has changed. And I would say now about a third of my students have a story where they had been asked to talk about a work that they did for a previous class and they didn't remember. And that for them was like a humbling, humiliating moment, forcing them to really realize like, oh no, maybe I have overused these things, right? One of my students told me a truly nightmare story where they were in an internship and they were in the elevator with the boss. And the boss asked like, oh yeah, you mentioned this paper in your application. Like, what was that about? Like, tell me more about that. And she knew nothing about it. She couldn't remember a single thing. She couldn't remember a single idea. She couldn't remember the readings. She couldn't remember anything. And that for her was this moment of like, oh no, like this new tool came out that our students have had to self-navigate healthy use of. And spoilers, I just don't think a lot of people self-navigated healthy use of that correctly. And so that's a whole third variable that I think we need to figure out now too. But yeah, so going back to that, when I asked about there being a consistent AI policy, one thing I would encourage first and foremost, whatever the policy does end up being, I'm a big, big, big believer in disclosure right now. So I'll drop my link in the chat to like the disclosure form I use. But I tried to make something that was light. This is a 30-second thing for all of my students to fill out. But something along these lines, I have found helps a lot. A, it can help in the classroom to both start these conversations, to demystify it. Also, as faculty, I talk about my own AI use. Here are the things I have done in this class. Here are the ways I have used AI, but also here are the ways I would never use AI. Don't worry. And I have found that just kind of normalizing that in my classroom, hey, it's okay to disclose, right? I disclosed my AI use. The cops didn't bust through the walls and arrest me. Don't worry. How about you? What's your AI use like? I have found that really norming that in the classroom, especially in these first year classes, matters a lot. But then also when you're talking sort of about like a sort of assessment level, having honest disclosure from the students on how they use these things feels pretty valuable to me. Because if my students use these quote unquote just for grammar versus if they used it in every step of the writing process versus if they used it to help them just outline, those three things really show different like cognitive processes that I'm going to give different types of feedback to. And I just need to be aware of that. And so for what you're talking about in terms of like the critical thinking sort of assessing, I could see this being valuable too. Because then also, if you have students turn in that, that chat with Gemini or ChatGPT or whatever as part of that, suddenly you actually can really see their critical thinking there. You can see the kind of questions they're asking the chat. Maybe that's part of that assessment in the future, right? Like in my class, the way they're using AI and like actually, I have multiple lectures about like good versus bad prompting, when you should start a new chat, when deleting context is important. We go through these conversations, and then seeing the way they interact with chat is literally part of it for me. Seeing that they have evolved from the beginning to the end of the semester and gotten more mindful on this. And also, so many of my students are so deeply motivated by ecological impact. Great. A big part of what we've done now is I've made them 10% more efficient using this. If they have 10% fewer queries on ChatGPT over the next 2 years, that pays for that too, right? There is real value in that to me. So yeah, that's been sort of the approach that, again, I'm just sitting down and hearing this and spitballing some ideas, but I think that sort of transparency approach would be something if nothing else, I would really try to push there.
Thanks for that.
Okay, so is multiple choice dead? What are your thoughts on multiple choice quizzes and tests? Are they dead now with, agentic AI?
I think if we're talking about entirely online, maybe. I think if you want to, when I'm making quizzes, there's always a few questions I throw on there, hoping all of my students get them, right? Like these are the sort of the easy questions that I'm just hoping buoy the grade up a little. If some of those are multiple choice, I think that's probably fine. And in-person quizzes, multiple choices probably still has a place. But yeah, I think giving a full 100 question multiple choice exam as your final exam feels dicey for me in most fields now. I'm not going to say it's totally dead, because the moment I say that, I'm sure some brilliant person will come up with like a really great multiple choice exam. But I definitely think it's taken a real hit, if nothing else. I'm hesitant. I have a hard time imagining me using a multiple choice exam in my Latin classes.
Okay, so online discussions. Do you feel that is it gonna just end up being students using AI to write their part of the discussion, and then just the instructor answering with AI? What do you think about that?
Well, I really hope it's not instructors answering with AI. I am very strongly against AI assisted grading. I am
Okay.
like the research about bias in AI, both covert and overt bias, is huge and profound and has not changed. I should say I'm annoying. I run an AI literature reading group, so I'm that guy who just has like a spreadsheet of a few dozen articles that I can just cite at people whenever I'm like defensive about it, like an octopus throwing out ink, and like. I think like Hoffman et al. Is one of the ones that I think about a lot. It's probably one of the most impactful. Let me drop this in the chat.
Yes,
people are curious later.
With it.
But this is a paper where they were looking at dialect bias. And it was literally just like, what if we have two job applicants who have basically all of the same criteria, but one uses African American vernacular once or twice in their cover letter? Suddenly, they never get hired, right? What if you have two people who have the exact AI, you are a juror. These people have the exact same case files, but one of them has an ethnic name. Oh, crazy how that person's always guilty, right? Like AI has very well measured, consistent, clear bias issues. It is not like really all that arguable in the research. And I cannot imagine a world where I'm bringing this tool into grading. And I'm actually deeply worried, because I know part of the idea is like, well, no, we're not going to like totally turn it over. We're just going to make these tools that are grading assistants, and then faculty can, kind of make their own. I'm just going to point out that that is literally never the way that these things work. I would encourage you, first of all, if anyone here is on Canvas, I don't know about you, but I think I keep running into is faculty who have the AI generated subtitles on Canvas that they've literally never checked. Because the moment that this does the work automatically for them, it is doing the work. Like we can say it's a subtitle assistant as much as we want, but if that assistant is doing work that no one else is doing, it's just not an assistant at that point.
And I would say, just pulling, anybody who's been a teaching assistant, how much did the professor really check what you were doing, especially after you were doing it for a little while?
Well, and the other thing I would point to is this is another paper that I really liked recently. This is Wilson et al. No thoughts, just AI. Biased LLM hiring recommendations alter human decision making and limit human autonomy. So this is they did a study where people were getting lists of resumes that they had to pick who would get hired, and they had AI intentionally, sometimes with AI suggestions, sometimes without. And they also had AI intentionally giving good and bad recommendations. About half the time, it would intentionally give bad recommendations. And what they found is about 90% of the time, people just thumbs up whatever AI said. Right? Because at the end of the day, we're lying to ourselves if we say that these tools won't be overly relied on. Everyone hates parts of their job. I know tons of people who hate grading. And the moment a thing exists that allows them to do it with slightly less, they will. I get that. I entirely get that. I think it's a crazy thing to be like, no, people will be smarter than that. Like, no, we won't. We never have been in the course of history, right? Hiring sucks. Hiring is terrible. We created a tool that just is supposed to help with hiring, and it's now like potentially causing lawsuits because people are using it way too much, right? And I just think about that. I think it's a lie to tell ourselves that this is just a grading assistant. There are 100, especially if you're looking at like overworked adjuncts. When I first started teaching, I was teaching like 9 classes a semester. If you told me that I had a tool that could like radically lower my grading amount, yeah, of course I would use that. So I have deep hesitations there. But when it comes to the original discussion that I've totally went a tangent from, but discussions, okay. I think I have mixed feelings on discussions because honestly, I feel like the discussions in my class, some of them still work, some don't. And I've had to really, really, really like demolition a bunch of the discussion posts that I had used to ask. But I have found that like, I'm teaching this class right now, writing 3045, writing for the emergent workplace. And I do have a number of discussions on that where the discussions are usually like, take something. I found that using discussions as part of scaffolding still works, is I guess what I'm getting to. When I have discussions be, hey, talk with 3 other students in this class and game plan how each of you is going to start this next paper. I find that those seem to still work. They're not perfect, but they work way more than like the old discussion posts of like, tell me 2 interesting things about the reading. Yeah, those are dead. Those discussion post types are dead. I think if you're using discussion posts as a way to create community, right? If you're using them as a way to actually get some level of interchange between your students, that can work. I also am a big believer in group work in asynchronous classes. I know some people really hate this, but actually I found that asynchronous like group work is super nice because when 4 students have to together do a project, the first thing they have to do is they have to between the 4 of them, they have to figure out where the line is on these tools. The 4 of them, without a big adult scarily leaning over their shoulder, they have to figure out what is ethical for AI use in their group project. And they have had this debate that all of a sudden I don't have to have at them. And I think that's really valuable. And I think discussions can play a role in that. But yeah, I'm with you that like, I do not think any discussion, any class that is online discussion based probably needs hugely reworked. I think that, again, they can play a role, but they can't be a major support of the classes, I would argue, anymore.
Matt?
I was just going to share with Christopher my concerns. Like I have other concerns about AI tools in general and in education,
Please.
but the assessment piece is a part that really makes me uncomfortable, and I'm being diplomatic when I say it that way. But Christopher, again, like referencing your like for science fiction. On the other hand, tools like HonorLock or DocuSign, like, it brings some sort of, well, I'm going to just say it, the surveillance state into the classroom environment. And so, again, if we could have an ethical AI detection software that was equally as ethical as the tools that students are using, that would be great. But that's not the world that we're living in. And so I'm also not terribly persuaded by the time savings argument when we talk about assessment, or as you mentioned, some of those other tasks that we hate. I think some of those tasks are still important, and we need to be the human in that loop at times. But again, we're in this moment of great transformation and change, and nobody's really having some of the conversations that you've mentioned. There's shadow use, there's, all of these things are happening, and we're just not having some of those conversations with our students and with our colleagues because of that sort of fear factor.
Oh yeah. I mean, sorry. 100%. No part of me was saying I hate grading and therefore we should. I'm just saying that, like,
Yeah.
I think that every job has parts of it that are people's least favorite parts. And the moment that these tools can kind of help, they can assist in automating that. Some people are just going to automate it entirely, and that's a real worry I have. But yeah, I mean, I'm totally with you on the surveillance state thing. I think there's degrees of surveillance state. I think anyone who looks at something like a Proctorio-esque or a lockdown browser at the same level they look at AI detection, I think there's shades of surveillance state for sure. But like when we're talking about part of my frustration with the surveillance state, like the lockdown browser, Proctorio sort of approach, I also just don't think it works. Right, like full stop. Like during the pandemic, I worked. So again, I've been a tutor for hire for since 2007. Right, I have worked with tons of students in all sorts of places. And I've had one thing that's nice about being a tutor is you're not the student's grader. Like they will just be honest about stuff. And I've had so many students give me detailed itineraries essentially for how they cheat on Proctorio. Right.
Mhm.
And like I had a student who had a whole during the pandemic who had a whole thing, right, where he just, the whole like at the beginning where you show it the room you're in, he just did that with all of his notes in his hand. So he would show them the room and then as soon as he put his laptop down, just tape it all up on the wall and then take his exam. And he did that for his entire college degree, right? Because he literally started in 2019 and graduated in 2023. I'm by all means, there's a whole ethical thing I have yelled at that student about. I'm not in any way saying like that's okay, but also if that is how secure those tools are, it's essentially just security theater at that point to me, right? And like that's worrying too. I'm not saying there aren't places where like a lockdown browser could be valuable. Maybe into testing centers, I would actually be very in support of lockdown browsers, and maybe there are some places where these things make sense. Um, but I worry again. We're tricking ourselves into thinking things work. I think actually admitting that some of these things don't work is the first step to actually renovating them.
So, Christopher, we're getting towards the end of our hour. If we were to do something like 5 years from now, what do you think AI in assessment will look like 5 years from now?
It's interesting. So I've got mixed thoughts on this, right? I think we're going to have very different. First of all, I think we're going to have way more oral assessment. I think we're going to have way more you talk, like you as a student talking with faculty, or maybe you as presentations. I think are going to be normed in basically every field. And if it's not a presentation, maybe it is actually an old school one-on-one oral assessment. I think that is probably going to happen. I also think we're at a really interesting place where it kind of depends what higher ed does going forward. I think the instinct that I keep seeing here of like, let's just augment faculty with let's give faculty more students to be responsible for, but also AI tools to help make that tenable. I think that's a bad path. I think that's the path I keep seeing a lot of leaders kind of, especially if you're someone outside of the classroom and you're just looking at the spreadsheets of like the budget, that solution might make sense. But actually, I think that that's going to be pretty bad if we go that path. I already know faculty who are leaving higher ed because it is impersonal and it's not what they thought it was going to be. And I kind of think this will just perpetuate that, if I'm honest. But I do think that if we go the other direction, we have more courses with smaller and like maybe not one-on-one, but maybe these classes are 10 to 15 students for a lot of these, where I actually have time to really get to know my students, their writing styles, where things break down versus where, what are kind of common issues I see with them. I think that could really work. And then we could have AI in those places, right? I'm working with each of those students almost one-on-one, working with each of them on how these tools work for them. I think that could be huge. I also think 5 years from now we'll be through this whole awkward fight we're having about AI detection right now, and it'll be funny because everyone's going to be right and wrong at the same time, and it's going to be deeply infuriating. Because one thing that I would say is pretty clear in the literature right now is like people are figuring out AI detection. It has literally only gotten better over the last 3 years. At this point, you have Pangram that is consistently getting 98% and with 0 false positives, right? Like that is pretty profound. But the other thing that's a real problem for that company is that students are now cutting AI into so many parts of their writing process that to me, I kind of wonder if it's not going to matter, right? Like down the road, like I already had this happen. I had a student who I always say he blew a 99.8, but because I'm thinking of AI detection like a breathalyzer for some reason, but his thing came back as essentially fully AI written. And my policy is when I use AI detection, I always meet the student ahead of time. I'm never going to report a student without having talked to them. So, okay, I call this student in, we go through their paper, and he's able to show me that the reason, like, he spent dozens of hours on this paper. What he had done, though, was he was using 3 different LLMs, one of which he used to help organize, another of which he used to give him critical, highly critical feedback that he would incorporate, and a third one that was always like positive rewriting. And he had went through this whole kind of process using these different LLMs and his own work to create this highly polished piece that did have just a ton of AI writing in it. But it's hard for me to say that those weren't his thoughts. It's hard for me to say those weren't his words, right? He had organized this piece from scratch and just used AI every step of the way. And of course, that's going to eventually cause it to trip AI detection. And I think we're going to enter a world where 5 years from now, AI detection mathematically has been figured out, but it maybe will only matter when you're catching the laziest cheaters, right? That like, sure, the student who truly just copy pasted the output and did nothing else, sure, that kid will get caught. But ultimately, tons of students who are using these tools ethically are still also going to get 100. And that's going to really complicate things. And we're going to be back to square one then. That's sort of my prediction with AI detection.
Any last questions for Christopher?
I guess just one more. Based on even that answer too, Christopher, to what extent are some of the issues that we're experiencing now actually going to be self-correcting? Like, again, the student who's used AI to cheat all the way through a 4-year degree finally ends up in the boardroom or in the elevator with the boss and can't explain like that will be another narrative or another variable that I think students will begin to understand. Fair?
Yeah, I think so. I think I would totally, this is what I said before, that I would feel so much better about these tools hitting 5 years earlier or 10 years later, is like, I feel like right now the consequence, like there's a lot fewer safety nets, and the consequences for those things, like, sure, it'll self-correct in a way that sucks for that student. And like, maybe that's what that student needs, but also this is like one of the least friendly job markets to new college graduates I think that's ever existed, right? I mean, if you're looking at like Brynjolfsson or Hosani Mesum, right, both of those literally find like a 20 to 25% shortfall in entry level positions right now because of AI. And I think that's where some of my anxiety is that like the timing, it just couldn't be worse. But you're totally right. I think there are some of these issues that are self-correcting. I don't think all of them, for what it's worth. I do think the way that AI has kind of impacted higher ed, that is not self-correcting. We have to correct that. Like, it needs manually to be corrected. And I keep getting frustrated because I keep being in these rooms where people are like, well, we need to wait for more details. It's like, I actually think that's a bad instinct. There is no cavalry coming. Like, we are the cavalry.
Yes.
That by dint of historical accident, we are the people who are here right now, and we have to figure this out. And that sucks. It's a lot of work, and I don't think any of us are paid enough for what it's worth. But like, if we don't figure this out, 10 years down the line, people who have way less of a memory of a pre-AI higher ed are going to have to try to. That feels worse. And 30 years from now, when no one remembers pre-AI higher ed, I don't think they will be in a position to actually make reasonable, like, positive changes. Like, we are the people who have to figure it out today. Not today. It's, a few days before Thanksgiving, but, like, in the near future.
Thank you for listening to Delulu is Sululu's AI Update. Our theme music is Transcend by Soundroll, licensed by Upbeat. You can find more great music at upbeat.io.